Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to today's mini lecture, which is on our first day of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula and on Stephen Arata's article, The Occidental Tourist. So, what I want to do today is to first give a little bit of historical background on the novel and on Bram Stoker, and then go over some of the main points of Arata's reading of Dracula, and then I'll present to you some potential topics you can talk about on Facebook this week. So, in terms of background, Dracula was published in 1897, and when it came out, it actually wasn't hugely successful. It wasn't unsuccessful, but it was what we might call a medium seller. It did okay. It wasn't one of the more popular books of the year. It didn't actually become a huge cultural phenomenon until the 1931 movie starring Bela Lugosi came out, and that was very successful. And then after that, the book became much more popular and much more of a pop culture phenomenon. And the reason why they filmed the movie in 1931 is by that point it was out of copyright. So Bram Stoker was an Irish writer. He actually knew Oscar Wilde, and we'll talk about that more in a later class. But during his lifetime, he actually wasn't primarily known as a writer, though he wrote a couple of novels and short stories. But he was more well known as being the personal assistant to one of the big celebrity actors of the era, who was a man named Henry Irving. And Henry Irving owned a theater in London called the Lyceum Theater, and Bram Stoker was also the business manager of that theater. And according to many people, Dracula, the character, was based on Henry Irving. So at the time, the novel was considered something that we might call a techno thriller. And what I mean by that is that the novel was very self consciously up to date in terms of the technologies it references. Uh, there's references to the typewriter, which at that point had been very recently invented. There's a blood transfusion machine, which was a new technology at the time. Interesting side note is that the blood transfusion machine was invented some years before they discovered the existence of blood types. So many people died because they didn't realize that you had to, when you infuse blood in someone, you have to have the same blood type. Uh, there's Dr. Seward who uses wax cylinders to record his diary in an early version of the phonograph. And that sort of the ability to record yourself an audio was very new and up to date. And also, many of the events that are referenced in the book are also very self consciously very recent. And you probably noticed reading the novel is that a lot of the issues we've been talking about that were big hot button issues in the 1890s are all referenced here, either implicitly or explicitly. So the novel itself, for its original readers, would have seemed very topical and up to date and very invested in high tech, in high technology. And all of that serves in contrast to Dracula, who's supposed to represent this ancient, pre modern force of evil. And so, what I want to do now is talk about Stephen Arata's article, The Occidental Tourist, which places Dracula in the context of debates and anxieties surrounding British imperialism and about race and racism. Okay? So, something that it's important to keep in mind is that in the vampire mythos, the vampire is not associated with Transylvania until the publication of Dracula. The two major earlier literary works that talk about vampires, one of which is John Polidori's short novel *The Vampires*, spelled Vampyre, is not set in Transylvania, and neither is Sheridan Le Fanu's short novel *Carmilla*, which came out about 20 years before Dracula. That's not set in Transylvania either. So that is the Transylvanian setting is his own innovation. And as Arata states, it places the novel in the context of what was known in the late Victorian period as the Eastern Question. And what that means is that in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was very obviously in decline, and as a result, Eastern Europe was in a state of disorder and disarray. And there was a great deal of racial conflict among different Eastern European racial groups and a lot of political strife as the result of the decline of this empire. Okay? So, what Arata says is that Dracula's references to his race, which is a term he uses quite a bit, especially in the first part of the novel, are intentionally ambiguous. He's either referring to himself as being one of the Slavic races and of being these kind of noble, conquering warriors, or he could be referring to himself, his race, as being the race of vampires, who are, of course, also conquerors of a sort, insofar as Dracula wants to go and essentially take over England by making everyone there into vampires. And something that is made clear then is that vampires come about as the result of a racial and imperial decline. And that's becomes obvious when Stoker is placing his novel in Eastern Europe in the declining Ottoman Empire. So then the fact that Dracula is planning to move to London, right, to kind of continue his plan, his project, indicates that this racial and imperial decline is going to move from Eastern Europe to London and to the British Empire. So during the 1890s, there was this general sense that the British Empire might be going into an era of decline. And we can see how that might be associated with the decadent movement, right? Which is interested in seeing modernity as an era of decline rather than an era of progress. And something that we see in a lot of British cultural works, novels, and such written during the 1890s is this fear of what we might call reverse imperialism. The idea that Britain, this great colonizing culture, is actually going to be itself colonized and will no longer be kind of on top of the world. And one of the ways in which this is expressed in the novel is how much Dracula is notably stronger and more powerful, we might say, actually comes from a stronger race than all of the British men in the novel, who are, until the very end at least, kind of effete and ineffectual and don't have that kind of warrior mentality that used to be associated with the aristocracy and is especially associated with the aristocratic Dracula. So, what's significant about the way that Dracula goes on his rampages is that he doesn't actually destroy his victims, of course. He doesn't kill them, but instead he takes away their individuality by making them vampires, by making them similar to him, by making them part of this new race of vampires. So, as Arata says, what Dracula does by making his victims into vampires is he deracinates them and makes them part of his own stronger conquering race. And to that extent, Dracula is also this super virile, masculine, manly man, because compared to the British men, he's much more able to reproduce, right? To spread his vampirism around into what he calls his children. Something else which is notable about vampirism in the novel is the strong extent to which it is associated with women. Other than Dracula himself, all of the other victims of vampirism in the novel are women. And the way in which these women's vampirism expresses itself is through this kind of quote-unquote monstrous and insatiable sexual appetite that becoming a vampire makes arise in women. So we can see similarities here to representations of Salome and critical representations of the new woman, right? Insofar as the idea is that once women are no longer disciplined by domestic ideology and by patriarchy and by having to be a wife and mother, if you let their sexuality just kind of run wild, they would become these castrating monsters who would go out there and steal men's virility and power and become these castrating sex monsters. And that's what we're seeing in the female vampires in the novel. So, in some sense, the novel's central conflict is over who is going to have access and control over women's bodies. Is it going to be Dracula with his vampirism, or is it going to be the quote-unquote good British men? Which group is going to be able to successfully propagate their race? And another point that Arata calls attention to is the extent to which the desire to colonize bodies and to colonize territories that Dracula expresses, right? He wants to make all of the people he encounters, he wants to remake them into his own image by making them vampires. And he wants to take over new territories and exercise his power over new territories. That, in that sense, Dracula is actually mirroring exactly what the British themselves are doing as colonizers. They want to take over territories and they want to remake colonized people over into their own image. The British themselves are quote unquote metaphorically vampirizing people. So insofar as the representation of Dracula is actually an implicit critique of British imperialism, that might be attributable to the fact that Stoker is, of course, Irish, and Ireland, at this point in its history, was essentially a British colony and was being exploited by the British. So that's basically what I have to say about the background to the book and the article. So some of the topics that you might want to discuss on Facebook for this class is you talk about the representation of Jonathan Harker in relations to perceptions of the decline of British masculinity, along with the decline of, or the perceived decline of the British Empire. You might think about the relationship between Jonathan Harker and Dracula in terms of Eve Sedgwick's argument about the Gothic that we read a couple weeks ago for Jekyll and Hyde, and what she calls paranoid relations between men. So that would be her argument that in the Gothic novel, men's fear of their potential for same-sex desire is often represented as one man being pursued by another man who's threatening him. You would talk about the characterization of Dracula, especially as it compares or contrasts with later representations of Dracula. So the way looking really closely at the way Dracula is actually represented in the book in comparison to later cultural stereotypes about Dracula from the Bela Lugosi movie or from other cultural works. You might think about the way the novel describes Transylvania and how it seems backwards and primitive compared to descriptions and accounts of London in the book, where it seems very modern and cutting edge, up to date. You might think about how the sexuality of vampire women is represented as being both monstrous in a kind of Salome sense, but also at the same time as being desirable and their ability to seduce men. Or you might think about the strong emphasis on technology in the novel and the different technological marvels that we find throughout the book and what their significance might be to the novel's larger themes and ideas. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Bye.